Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Secular Soapbox on Promethean Secular Frontier. This is a show where we like to share our opinions on various topics from a secular perspective. I'm your host, Bryce Aroni, and today we are going to be examining the Transcendental Argument for the existence of God. If you guys have followed Secular Soapbox recently, you'll know that we kind of tackle arguments like these every now and again to try to figure out not only why theists believe these things, but how they rationally justify their positions, particularly in apologetics, when they're talking to skeptics and atheists and agnostics, trying to come up with good reasons to believe what they do. The transcendental argument is one of them that's used. And most recently, we talked about the Kalam cosmological argument, actually last week, which keeps coming up, but doesn't seem to ever go away no matter how many times I think it's been debunked. But we had Ben Watkins on that show, and we actually have him back today. He's going to help us break down the transcendental argument. So Ben Watkins, host of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we've moved on from the KCA to the TAG, I guess we could call it, right? That transcendental argument.
The transcendental argument for God's existence, or TAG.
Fair enough. And to help you out here, just so that you're not all alone in explaining, we also have another guest with us. He's going to be mostly audio because he's having video issues right now, but we've got Thomas Levi, also known as Tom the Atheist on Twitter, aka Tom, your friendly neighborhood atheist. And he likes to discuss various beliefs and the flaws behind belief on his YouTube channel, Thomas Levi. Tom, can you hear us?
I can.
Awesome. Welcome to the show. And Ben was just about to explain, I think, the transcendental argument. And if I haven't asked the question yet, what is the transcendental argument for the existence of God? Because I think that that's one that is not as commonly brought up in these kind of theological debates. Most people hear about cosmological argument, ontological argument. What is transcendental argument?
Yeah, so now's probably, I promise it won't be a death by PowerPoint, but I do have a couple slides. Now might be just a good time to bring them up and just give a little bit of history of this argument, because there's an entire tradition in philosophy known as the presuppositionalist tradition. Now, we know it commonly as the presuppositional apologetic, and so they're making use of the presuppositionalists' traditions argument that's tag
logic.
So I know that some of their apologists can be annoying, to say the least. I guess that's the best way I can put it. There really are some sophisticated thinkers. If you go to the next slide, Van Til and Greg Bahnsen, while I might have great disagreements with them, they are continuing in a rationalist tradition that started with Kant and Hegel. And so the German idealists who thought, that reason was supreme and that we could know the world in and of itself by using something like reason. So while natural theology tries to prove God's existence from, observations in the world, kind of going into this objective third-person world that we all share, the presuppositionalist tradition says, no. God's existence, in fact, the God of the Bible's existence, is a necessary precondition for knowledge itself. So Kant famously tried to pick up the pieces from Hume of how we can have knowledge. And so he kind of had this sort of transcendental idealism. And so I won't bore you with the history of all of that. But
so it sounds like they're saying, in order to build on a basis of, in order to have a basis of knowledge, there has to be not only a God, but specifically the God of the Christian Bible.
Yeah, to reveal things to us. So that what they want to say is that if there were no God, or if there wasn't the God of the Christian Bible, then we could not know anything at all, because the revelation from the Christian God is a necessary precondition for knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so this is downstream of anything in natural theology. The presuppositionalist wants to say something much bolder. They want to say that, look, knowledge can't even get off the ground unless you have God. So we can move on to the next slide, and I'll kind of, we'll do the next one. I'll kind of show you how they do this. So there's a famous trilemma in philosophy called the Munchausen trilemma. So
I'm glad you pronounced that, because I wouldn't have been able to.
So it's also called Agrippa's paradox. So the idea goes that the justifications we believe constitute knowledge either have further justifications ad infinitum, justify themselves, or are self-justifying, so they're circular, or some things are intrinsically justifying or self-evident. So
do me a favor before you go on.
Before
you go on, I don't want to interrupt you, but I just got a request. Be careful about tapping your desk, because it creates an audio issue every time you do. So
fair enough.
Yeah.
So
sorry, go ahead.
The third of these seem the least objectionable. So the first doesn't seem like it could see. We can't just have reasons all the way down. And it doesn't seem like circular arguments support their conclusions. So there must be some things that are self-evident. So this is where, if we go to the next slide, the worry of skepticism comes about. Mm-hmm. So the problem here is that if we accept the claims we cannot know our reasoning is justified, and we accept the claim that we must know our reason is justified to have knowledge, then we can't know anything. So this is the case that the presuppositionalist is trying to make. They're trying to say, look at this big worry. Like, those two premises seem really plausible. And so it seems like we have this problem. So next slide. Enter presuppositionalism to try to say, look, we cannot know our reason is justified unless we have a revelation from the Christian God. And we must know our reasoning is justified to have knowledge. Therefore, we cannot know anything unless the God of the Christian Bible exists. And so we have now a transcendental argument.
Isn't that special pleading, though? Because if you can't know that your reasoning is justified without a Christian God, and you're only asserting that you can know that your reasoning is reasonable with a Christian God, how do you demonstrate that? Isn't that just an assumption with...
So you're not demonstrating it. So they're saying that it's a precondition to even have demonstrations. So like if you were to say, demonstrate something, just the very act of trying to go out in the world and to know that there is this world and there is these things like other minds, and that we can have knowledge of the world and find our way intelligibly around the world presupposes God's existence. That's the argument. And so
now, but
if you're saying, how do you demonstrate it? You would, so it's obvious that not very many people think this argument works. So there was plausibility when Kant, used it, because he was saying, look, we have to impose things like concepts of causation onto the world. Like that seems true. Like, we might not be able to understand causation, but our minds have to project causation on the world. That has some plausibility. But to say that our minds have to know that God exists, or that God's divine revelation is a necessary condition, something that has to be imposed on the world, doesn't have the same plausibility.
Yeah. So when I looked this argument up, and like I said at the beginning, I think we were talking backstage, and I like to mention that I tend to presume that I have a lay audience, and so I try to speak from the perspective of a lay audience. In reality, I didn't know much about the transcendental argument because it's not one that comes up too much in my discussions. So I just looked up Wikipedia. What does Wikipedia have to say about this, just to give me kind of a basis of what they're doing? And I was able to find a basic syllogism on Wikipedia. The entry says that the transcendental argument for the existence of God attempts to prove the existence of God by arguing that logic, morals, and science ultimately presuppose a supreme being. And the syllogism is basically God is a necessary precondition for logic, like you said. People depend on logic and morality, it adds, therefore God exists. I don't find it to be a particularly compelling argument, especially if you're trying to lock it to the Christian God of the Bible, because what's to stop a Muslim from doing this with Allah of the Quran, or a Mormon from doing it from the Mormon version of God in the Book of Mormon, or Hindus from doing it from the Bhagavad Gita? So, like, I don't understand how this gets you to Christ. Or is it meant to?
Yeah, no. Well, so that's it's not meant to. That's the trick here. In one sense, but in another, it's really to give reinforce the Christian's faith that they have. It's because you're absolutely right. One of the obvious objections to this is, well, why can't if this argument is sound for you, why isn't it sound for a Muslim? And sound arguments can't give contradictory answers, so someone has to be mistaken.
Right.
That just seems, that's a standing criticism of the apologetic. But really I think deep down, what it's trying to get at is to say, look, this is a way that you can be confident in your faith. And that when someone like you or me don't find this argument compelling, they already have an answer for that. It's because we're suppressing that truth and unrighteousness.
Which means nothing, by the way.
Yeah.
That's a claim that's completely circular, because that's a claim from the Bible, supposedly written by the God that they're trying to make an argument for. So that doesn't work unless you're indoctrinated to believe that in the first place. I think that's probably what you were saying now, right?
Well, yeah. Well, and that's what the apologetic gives, though. It gives that defense mechanism to say, like, look, if someone's just disagreeing with you, they're literally talking nonsense. They're literally embracing an absurd worldview, and that you don't have to take anything seriously from that worldview. There is no neutral ground on which our worldviews can be compared. Everything has to be on this truth, and so it's. I think what biblical fundamentalists find this attractive, because it stakes everything on the Bible, and so that's obviously going to be very attractive to a fundamentalist who wants to say,
it seems like they haven't really properly thought it through, though, because if they were actually convinced that this would make a good argument, then this should make a good argument to any other believer of any other faith. But they can make the exact same argument. That's the problem. The argument doesn't work if it works.
And so they would say that, those other worldviews contain absurdities. And by being able to point to those absurdities, that's what you're going to be able to say, these are the absurdities that my worldview, the Christian worldview, doesn't have. But now there's still the remaining question of, well, does Christian theism really resolve any of the alleged absurdities? And so, like, kind of the one that I gave, where it's like, the skepticism, the problem of skepticism, you just throw that out. Most people don't really know how to approach the problem of skepticism when they first see it. And it kind of, hits them and like, oh, how do I solve this problem? But just by saying the God of the Bible reveals it to us in such a way that we can be certain to use the apologetic, it doesn't seem like we're getting sort of any explanatory power. It seems that the world is going to appear exactly the same between our worldviews. But the presuppositionalist is going to have a model that has a whole lot of baggage on it. It's going to make presuppositions that something like a naturalistic worldview that would be more attractive somewhat to people like you and I, they just aren't going to have to make. And so by Occam's razor, you can just shave it. Like, I don't have to make those presuppositions. I might make presuppositions elsewhere. I might presuppose the laws of logic. I might, presuppose my own rationality. There might be things I do presuppose, but I don't have to presuppose Christian theism. And so if you think simplicity,
the more things that you presuppose, the greater your chances are of being wrong. That's
exactly.
That's the whole
That's
point
exactly
of
right.
Razor. You want to minimize unnecessary entities, right?
What's called intrinsic probability. And so it's to recognize this point is to recognize that presuppositional apologetics is intrinsically less likely than something. So let me ask,
Tom, you first of all, I'm glad you're back. It looks like you were having some difficulties. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine.
What do you think about this whole transcendental proposition here? Do you think that this makes for a good argument?
The whole Kalam argument is based on the idea that God is real. We know God is real. Therefore, everything is proof of God. That's what it boils down to.
Which is completely circular, right?
I mean, it's this idea is there has to have been something that created us. And the only thing that could have created us is God. Therefore, God created us. I mean,
So it doesn't actually make any claims about God creating or anything. It's actually God revealing to us knowledge in such a way that we can be certain, to use the apologetic. That
the only reason we know it is because God told us. Therefore, God must be real because we know it.
So natural theology tries to prove God independent of revelation. Well, so is presuppositional apologetics part of natural theology? Well, no, because it appeals to revealed religion. And it says that is, look, you can't understand what it is to be human and to have a soul and to know what really matters without the revelation from the supreme being of whatever tradition that's part of. Usually a lot of presuppositionalists are Calvinists. They'll come from that sort of tradition. And
I don't, by the way, I don't attempt to argue with Calvinists. I've given up on Calvinism as the worst religion that any man has ever invented. It's definitely something invented by man, and it's the worst one. And I have many arguments for why. So I tend to not have any kind of debates. If I'm in a discussion and there's a Calvinist there and they say something, I usually just nod and smile and move on, because it's pointless to try to debate with them, especially if they're from a presuppositionalist background. But my position is ultimately this: anything which can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence, right? So if you're going to assert that God is necessary for knowledge and is the only reason that I have knowledge, you need to be able to demonstrate that in some way. And if you can't demonstrate it, if you don't even make the attempt to, if part of your argumentation is, I don't need to demonstrate it because it's true, then I don't need to address it. There's no reason for me to accept it as true, because my position is that it's false. In fact, I have, through my own evidence, my own anecdotal experience, I know that it's false. I know that statement is false. So in order to convince me otherwise, you have to be able to change my mind. And they don't even make the attempt to do that. So you can really just dismiss what they're saying, right? We don't need God for knowledge, and we definitely don't need God for morality. In fact, it might be impossible to have morality with God, at least with the God that they're claiming. The Calvinist version of God is not a moral being at all. So you literally have to redefine what morality is. I know that morality is not what the Calvinist God says. Therefore, their whole argument falls apart, that my knowledge of morality comes from that God. That was just kind of a rant. You guys can respond to that. But that's my reasoning for why, among other things, why this argument is to be dismissed, but especially if it comes from a Calvinist. So, and I don't see how they get around that.
If you ever listen to William Lane Craig,
and I don't think he is a Calvinist, right?
No, but his whole
nor a presuppositionalist.
Not all presuppositionalists are Calvinists.
His whole motive is he's tenacious. He does not give an inch. I mean, the idea that God is real to him is so fundamental to.
Well, that's the attitude of the apologist, to give that defense of the faith.
Right, and that's what they're supposed to do. I mean, if they're Christian apologists anyway, 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give reasons for the faith that you have.
Everything is proof of God. The fact that we can think, the fact that we can see, the fact that we find beauty in the world, everything is proof of God.
Some traditions say that existence itself is because of God's actualizing all being, and so he could stop sustaining the world at any time. Let's
talk about that one. Is that a rational argument? The idea, the claim, the proposition that existence is proof of God. Does that work?
It's never.
Well, that's a cosmological argument for the existence of God. So the Kalam is a version of that kind of argument.
Right. So I know that those kinds of arguments exist, but are they logical? Are they rational?
Because it basically ignores, millennia of people believing in gods for various reasons. It's ignoring all the other gods and pretending like nobody ever had any other reason to believe that there was a God other than the Christian God. The Christian God is the only one true God. It's always been there, kind of unknown until Jesus. But it was only
which to me kind of invalidates the entire argument. Because if the Christian God was unknown until Jesus, then you have no rational basis to conclude that your knowledge came from that God. You didn't know that the people who existed before Jesus came didn't know of that God. So they would not have concluded that their knowledge came from a God that they didn't know. That's not logical. Am I wrong?
Can we pull? Yeah, we actually have some premises for an argument here.
Yeah, go ahead.
If we go to slide 12, the second to last slide. One more back. Yeah, right there. So this is a huge problem for the Christian theist here, because it seems that there are people who are not culpable for not believing the salvation message of Jesus. And so that's exactly what you just pointed to. So these are what are isolated non-theists.
When you say not culpable for not believing Jesus, what do you mean?
So the theory is that we are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness in ourselves, and so that we are responsible for that. So we are guilty. We are without excuse.
Okay, now let's pause there. Suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. What does that mean?
It means that we actually do know that God exists, and that we're resisting that belief because we're in a state of rebellion against God.
Is it possible to disbelieve something that you know if knowledge is a subset of belief?
So we got to be tricky with this question.
Well,
you're right.
Everything.
Knowledge entails belief. So
right. So if knowledge entails belief, how could we not believe something that we know?
Because they say we do believe, and that what we are when we say that we don't, we are lying.
Oh, so then we could end the conversation right there, because if we know that what they're saying is, if we know that what they're saying is false, then they no longer have an argument, because they're basically accusing us of lying about. So
the second one on this slide here is there are former believers. There are people that are they're not resisting belief. They were presumably in a relationship with God, and they just don't believe now. They've looked at the evidence and they said, you know what? I just don't believe anymore. Mm-hmm. And so these are just more plausibly explained by the fact that these are non-resistant non-believers. They're not resisting. They're not rebelling against God and their unrighteousness. It's just an empirical fact about the world. Like when we go out into experience and we look through time and we see hundreds and thousands of people who've never heard the gospel message. There's people today that haven't heard the gospel message. They live their entire lives in fundamentally misleading systems of meaning.
And so this is kind of contradictory to even what Scripture says, because it's almost cherry picking Scripture, because the whole point of go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations is the fact that there are unbelievers. The Bible speaks of unbelievers, right? It talks about people who have not heard. How could they believe unless they come to hear the word? And how can they hear unless that there are, people going out to preach it? Paul makes that case. The purpose of evangelizing is to convince people. But that doesn't really work if everyone already knows. That's kind of a contradiction then.
Well, so I agree. It's more plausible that there are these non-resistant non-theists in the world. So now we can turn the tables on the tag argument. If we go to the last slide, this is what's known as the argument from divine hiddenness. And non-resistant non-theists actually furnish us with one of the key premises of that argument, and it directly undercuts tag. And so the first premise is that God's perfect love implies that he would always be open to relationship. And the second claim is that there are no non-resistant non-theists if God is always open to relationship, because a belief that God exists is a necessary condition for relationship. So it follows from those two premises that the existence of God implies there are no non-resistant non-theists, but we just saw that there are non-resistant non-theists, so it follows that God does not exist.
All right. Well, what do you think, Tom? Have you ever heard anyone actually make this argument to you other than because we can go online and we can watch videos of William Lane Craig and some other presuppositionalist apologists, make the tag the transcendental argument for God. But other than that, have you ever actually encountered someone in reality, whether in person or that you've debated before, that has made this argument?
My cousin kind of makes this argument.
Really?
And one thing I've noticed with a lot of like really not more than dedicated theists is they will change their argument. They'll come at it from so many different directions to say basically the same thing.
Yeah.
It
seems like tag is kind of lazy to me. It seems like it's the laziest argument. It's the one that they go to because they want to exercise the least amount of effort. You're basically saying the whole argument is, I don't have to prove that there's a God because everyone already knows that there's a God.
Yes.
And I mean, if that's the argument, then like I said, there's no reason. That's not really an argument. That's just you having a position that you're not going to attempt to prove the thing that you believe. You're going to assert that I know something that I don't know.
Yeah.
Therefore, I know that what you're asserting is wrong, and we don't have to go any further. That's why I call it the weakest. But
more than often, the argument is basically throwing shit at a wall and seeing what sticks. At one point, they can argue to the point where you're just like, I don't have a response because, and they're like, aha, I won.
Well, that's part of the apologetic too, not necessarily the philosophy behind it, but it's to quiet the fool, to speak, to put it crudely, but that's to have a defense of the faith, to have a response, so that people like us are left without excuse. And so it's not if you're judging the strength of the argument on its ability to convince other people, I'm sure most presuppositional apologists will concede to you that it's not meant to try to convince other people or bring other people into the fold. What's attractive about it is that it sacrifices the least biblically and stakes everything on the Bible the most. And so in a way, they see it as the most reverent, the most, worthy of, religious
the most
praise.
Virtuous, probably. And it's
most virtuous. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was trying to come up with a word other than righteous because I had used the righteous in the other context.
No, I got you. Before we go any further, let me take some time to acknowledge some of the people in the chat. We've got Do-Re Mimi, whose name I love. We've got producer Wes, who's taking the day off today, but we appreciate all the work you're doing behind the scenes. Linear, as always. PSF, who is Josh the Archon. We got Kat the Humanist. Who else is Eddie Brute Facts podcast, I should say. What's up, Eddie? Cool. And we have Sexy Sniper Panda. That is an amazing name. And actually, Sexy Sniper Panda has a question for us in the chat. So if we go ahead and highlight that, he wants to know, why does any religion need to have apologists if they are certain that what they believe is accurate and correct? Sounds like the opposite of science, where things are questioned until proven. I think that that's kind of a rhetorical question for this particular panel, because I have no doubt that everyone here already agrees with that. But I mean, it does raise a good question. If you believe that everyone already has knowledge of God, if that's your argument, then what's the point of being an apologist in the first place?
So Swinburne, Richard Swinburne, an Oxford theist philosopher of religion, famously argues that this is something that's very good in the world, that God would want, we can know a priori that God would want to create a world in which we had to go out into the world and evangelize. That's itself a great good. He thinks
Good
that
based
how
on what? Why is that good?
That's the Christian view. The Christian view is that God created this world and keeps an epistemic distance, so that we have the opportunity to evangelize to people that don't know the good news, and that bringing people into Christ in this way just is part of God's plan, and because God is good, that's a good plan too.
It just seems like it seems like an argument that cannibalizes itself as soon as it asserts that people don't know the good news. If your argument is you already know the good news, you've defeated your own argument before you've even.
Well, it's a very strange axiology.
Started, you know?
I mean, any other place,
I need to tell you that you already know what you think you don't know. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And I don't myself take it very seriously, other than the serious tradition in the philosophy of religion that kind of uses some weird way. Bonson and Van Til use some kind of strange ways to argue for their views, but it's interesting. It's a different take. It's a different take on things, but most presuppositional apologists can be insufferable.
Javier from the chat, Javier Hara, has another question. Wants to know, what good is an argument with a whole lot of fallacies disguised as logic? I can presuppose anything, assert is true, and if denied, you lie. I think that's kind of just saying that we went over that a little bit ago when we talked about how this can be used in other religions. One of the reasons why it shouldn't work to convince a skeptic is just the fact that if you can use the same argument in Islam as you can in Christianity, and they're both meant to get you to a particular God, then the argument doesn't work, right? You would have to presuppose that Allah and Yahweh are the same God. The problem is with a lot of the presuppositionalists, they don't presuppose that. They think that Allah is a false God. Muslims might tell you that they worship the same God as the Christian God, but most of these type of Christians won't. And so there's a problem there, because if Muslims can use the same argument that you're using and you can deny them by the same rationale, they can deny you. Right?
The way to put the point is that sound arguments don't give contradictory results. So if we can take the premises, this is actually under one of the defeaters for the ontological argument. The idea is like, okay, well, look, if you can have an unstoppable force, greatest possible unstoppable force, and the greatest possible immovable object, well, then you can use the ontological argument to drive contradictions. And so we can use tag and religious disagreement to drive contradictions. And so that's just an objection to it. It's what you're saying is irrational. And it's not that we're just saying that because we don't find it convincing, but because it entails a contradiction.
Right. Well, Leo Phileas actually has an opinion about that. He's another guy who's a brilliant kid, but we've had him on the show before and looking forward to having him back. But why do scientists need to defend science if they're so sure it's correct? Which is an argument you might hear. I'm sorry, but this idea that good ideas and true ideals don't need a defense or support is not very well placed. Yeah, and that really just goes to anything which can be asserted without evidence. We can dismiss it. It's a lazy argument in the sense that you're basically saying my argument is true, therefore I don't need to prove it. Well, then it's not an argument. That's called an assertion. So apologetics, when you can reduce them down to just assertions and get them to admit that they're not making an argument, doesn't really work. I looked up on Wikipedia. It suggested that this idea was popularized by Immanuel Kant. that suggesting that he was like the first one, but I don't know that that's true, because you had 4 different names up there, and you're saying that Kant's version comes from rationalism.
Hegel came after Kant. So Kant is kind of the one that pioneered this transcendental argument that kind of, famously combined the empiricist and rationalist traditions of his time. And so that was supposed to be part of, that was Kant's genius, is that he was able to say, well, hey, look, just from analyzing these concepts, it seems like things have to be this way, and things have to be this way, and things have to be this way.
But he wasn't appealing to presuppositionalism, though.
No. So this is just so presuppositionalist, the tradition much later down.
Hey, there we got Tom. We have a real Tom face. So
awesome. Welcome,
good
Tom.
to see you.
It took a few tries, but I made it.
So the problems that Kant raises and then tries to solve are the same problems that a presuppositionalist tradition would try to raise and then solve, except they would have an extra ingredient: God's divine revelation.
Yeah,
and so
which is begging the question to me. Like, that just makes all of your argumentation circular and therefore less reasonable.
Well, circular arguments don't support their conclusions. That's why they're fallacious, because we want our premises to support our conclusion.
Right.
And so if our conclusion is in our premises, then our premises don't support the conclusion. And so it's just not a valid argument.
So God is a necessary precondition for logic and morality, which is how Wikipedia puts it. Where does morality come into?
So that's probably a little misleading, because when people think, they should probably have used the word ethics there. So basically values and reasons and the theoretical domain. So there's the practical domain of, when we say morality, we think about practical principles of how we should act. But there's also epistemic values, how we should believe. And so they want to say, ethics is kind of the domain of both of those things. And so they want to say, look, God's a necessary precondition for even that, for logic, the laws of logic, rational principles for thought, mathematical principles. They would want to say those are like all of these things depend on God's divine revelation, because these things could not be without that divine revelation.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. And I get, appealing to the necessity of God. I don't get it. I don't want anyone to think that this actually makes sense. It doesn't make sense. But I can understand their attempt to assert that, the logical absolutes and mathematics and the laws of physics. And now when it comes to values, this is where I think their argument is even weaker than it already was, because we don't have the same values. We have different values. Morality is subjective. They would probably assert that it's objective, but we can disprove that.
I would say that morality is objective. So I'm a moral objectivist. So I would disagree that morality is subjective.
You're
right. I do think it is less plausible here, because it's not entirely clear how power can just imbue something with value. It's not like, can God just pour a little more value into something? It's not sure. It's not clear at all what God's existence makes to the value of something like love. Love is still just as valuable for my wife and my child and the rest of my family, whether God exists or whether God doesn't exist. It doesn't seem like God's existence makes any difference to value at all. And so, I think you're right. It's just implausible if you're going to say that God is a necessary condition for basic evaluative truths. Well, why? That's not obvious at all.
I apologize to everyone, by the way. I am sick. I am recovering from not COVID, but something else. So, and I'm having a choking attack right now. But try not to let that be a distraction. What do you think, Tom?
I fall on the moral subjectivist side. The problem with most arguments today is they are based in antiquity. These are the arguments they've been making for hundreds of years. And unlike technology and just knowledge in general, religious beliefs do not change. And as we've understood physics, lots of science, more and more, the arguments for religion make less and less sense. 400 years ago, the arguments that God exists because we know God exists made sense. Same way the earth is the center of the universe made sense. What happened to Galileo? They wanted to basically put him in prison because he found out the earth wasn't the center of the universe. These arguments that are still used today made sense hundreds of years ago. The problem is they cannot evolve because, one, they're based on nothing. I mean, hundreds of years ago, they made sense because they had really nothing to compare it to. It's like, how did we get here? I have no idea. Therefore, God. And it made sense. Now,
I would say,
how did we get here?
It's had to evolve. It has had to evolve in certain very crucial ways. Darwin made it evolve.
Yeah, I was going to say that when it comes to, and I disagree a little bit. Like, I understand what you were saying, Tom. I would say that religion does evolve, that religious beliefs do change, but they change very slowly.
Yeah.
And they evolve in the sense that they branch off into new ideas. The old ideas are probably still there, like these kind of arguments that you're talking about, but less people have them. But they still hold, because obviously not every Christian is a presuppositionalist.
Religion has had to evolve their interpretation of slavery a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Is that evolving or just adapting?
Well,
if you think of evolving,
you're actually both right.
Adapting is kind of working around things.
So you're actually both right, I would argue, because there are Christians who will adamantly defend biblical slavery. And then there are others who use different arguments to try to say it wasn't actually slavery. It was something else. It was the happy, friendly kind of
theology disagreements have certainly had to evolve. They have evolved. But
the point is, they don't all believe the same thing. They may have all used to believe along similar lines, but once science has revealed certain truths, a lot of them went off in this other direction but still believe,
Here's what I mean by it hasn't evolved is, like with science, the question of where did we come from? We keep finding new information that changes what we think.
We make progress.
Yeah. With religion, it's still God created us. Now, why and how, those things have changed, but this fundamental argument of God's existence, that hasn't changed at all. Now God, before it was a personal God and God talked to people, now it's God of beyond space and time, but it's still the same thing. It's changed, but it hasn't evolved. It's still God is real because God is real.
Yeah, I would say that, and this kind of touches on your, you were mentioning that a lot of the Christians proposing this have a very ethnocentric view of religion, of reality, because the assumption is that everyone knows the God that they think they know the way that they know it, when we can prove just by looking through history that that's not true. Everyone certainly they didn't even describe God in the same way as the Christians that are proposing this argument describe him. And when you look at other cultures, they didn't describe their gods, plural, in the same way. They had many different gods that are certainly nothing like what they're asserting that everyone knows. And so just on an empirical basis alone, we can disprove that assertion.
Yeah. Religion's actually a fairly recent phenomena, evolutionarily speaking.
Yeah.
It's only been around for something like 60,000 years or something, I think. But the most of the people...
Can't be right. That can't be right, Ben, because humanity has only been around for 6,000 years.
6,000 years. Well, so yeah. I'm a nuclear engineer, so I just have no respect for that position. So I just have to just roll my eyes and toss that to the side.
Now you said religion is a new idea, has only been around for 60,000 years. That doesn't mean that they didn't have they had other supernatural beliefs before religion.
Most people have been animists. So throughout history, like of all the people that have ever existed, most people have been animists. Their religious knowledge or religious object of worship was spirits in the rivers, in the trees, in animals, in the sun. Those were the types of religious traditions that have dominated most of history. And it's the idea of monotheism is actually super recently. Like, I mean, it was, the time period in which Moses supposedly, like, that was, kind of when, monotheism kind of came on the scene. And it, occurred in this, really kind of secluded desert region.
Well, Moses wasn't a monotheist.
Well, it's not even clear that Moses was a historical figure, so it's not like to say like
granted.
whether like he's almost certainly a literary fiction.
Sure, I understand that, but if we grant the premise that there was a Moses and that his character is accurately represented in the Old Testament, he wasn't a monotheist; he was a polytheist.
It's a very strange thing. That the Bible mentions other gods.
Yes,
it's a very strange
thing that God mentions other gods.
Yeah,
several times.
I mean, just the commandment, "Thou shalt have no other god before me," is admitting there are other gods. But I'm number one.
Right. So
you're forced to interpret those as saying that these are false idols and that these are figments. These aren't real gods out there, but these are gods that people really believe in. I think,
and that's the evolution that I was talking about of religion and how they're reinterpreting some of the old ideas. It's they still believe in the same God, but their interpretation of what he supposedly wrote or that
what he wants from us. Because it's, it used to be, he wanted us to have systems of slavery. And so that some people were inherently better than others in a way that some could own others. And that this was, something that this is how God wanted things.
So in looking at some of the rebuttals, which I think we've already given a lot of rebuttals to why none of us are convinced, but in doing some prep work, looking at the rebuttals that I were able to find online, some reject the validity of the argument, pointing out various flaws, such as category error involving the first premise of the argument, namely that just because there is a statement that is universally true, it will not make that statement part of reality itself. So that was one issue. And then another issue was pointing out that it is not needed to have a God to have logic and morality, which is kind of the thing I just talked about. You have a view that morality is objective. I would love to explore that a little bit more in depth on another show. And I think that Tom Jump actually shares that view as well. I don't agree with that, but that's an internal argument. I don't think morality is related to God at all, which I think is the argument I would be using to kind of invalidate this presuppositionalist argument. Morality, you called it ethics, but I don't think that these are related to gods at all. The issue of what makes something good or bad or right or wrong is independent from whether or not there's a God exists, so that's my position, and that's one of the reasons why I don't think that this particular line of reasoning works, that we need God for morality or ethics. That's something that has to be demonstrated. And if you just assert that it's true, and you also assert that God is okay with slavery, and it turns out slavery is unethical and immoral, well, then you're wrong. You're just wrong. And
I also want to blow your mind a little bit more and also admit I'm an objectivist about aesthetics too. So beauty, I think that there are objective ways of thinking about beauty.
You don't think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder?
You ever been in a modern art museum?
I have.
Yes.
And let me tell you, here's something that if beauty,
I think
is
phenomenal
objective,
consciousness is subjective. It's obviously by definition subjective, but I think that we can think about art in objective ways. The Mona Lisa is objectively better than your child's painting on the refrigerator.
No, the Mona Lisa is better than your child's painting. My child's painting,
yes, and that's an objective fact. That it's just an objective fact.
Yeah. As soon as Bryce is so right all the time, that is actually wrong. But I love you for saying it.
Gold star.
Wrong show. Meet me on my other show, The Bryce is Right, Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on the Atheist Network group. But this is Secular Soapbox. I would love to be proven wrong, but you can't prove someone wrong when you're not even willing to, if you're just willing to assert things. I don't like Calvinists and I don't like presuppositionalists in general, because basically their argument is you're a liar. So there's no reason to have a, you're a liar.
I mean, it's really hard. I know some people will roll their eyes and think that that's hyperbolic, or, that you're being uncharitable. And in a way, it's tongue in cheek. It is being,
I'm dead serious. I'm dead ass serious.
But you're very much right. Because at the end of the day, like, part of the view is that these people don't actually know that God exists. They actually do know that God exists. And so them telling to us that we don't, we are lying. Like, that's what lying is. It's like knowing something to be true and telling everyone something that we know is false. That's just lying.
Yeah. Let's go to a question from the chat. This is from Leo Filius. And I think he's responding to something Cafe, who is someone else in the chat, was saying. Why would a morally perfect agent allow even for the possibility of evil? Which is
it wouldn't.
A valid question.
This is a problem of evil. And so I just say it wouldn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
A morally perfect being couldn't create anything less than a perfect world. Just like a perfect craftsman couldn't create something less than a perfect craft. A perfect artist couldn't create anything less than a perfect work of art. Even the possibility of evil, especially if we get very particular about these, the possibility of things like horrendous evils, things where people suffer so horribly that they lose themselves entirely, or become to believe that their life is just no longer worth living on the whole.
I made an argument recently. I posted it on Facebook, and basically it's an impossible question. It's designed to be an impossible question for any theist who asserts that morality comes from God, which is all of them that I interact with every day. The question is, how would you know a good God from an evil God? Sounds like a fairly simple question, right? But it's a question that you can't answer if you're asserting that morality comes from God, because a good God might claim that it's good, and an evil God might also claim that it's good. How can you tell the difference?
Well, have you ever heard the argument that God or the devil's biggest trick on humanity was tricking people into believing that God wasn't real?
I've heard that before.
My comeback
is always, what he's saying.
Yeah, my comeback is always God's biggest trick on humanity was convincing people that the devil was the evil one.
Yeah, it's the same. There's no difference. There is no God and there is no devil either. Now that's not necessarily a statement of fact. It's a statement that I'm not rationally justified in believing in either.
Right.
So yeah.
I'll just borrow a line from Voltaire that a witty saying proves nothing.
Yeah. So Bryce, you say that morality is subjective.
Yes.
What do you think evil is?
Evil is the name that we place on things that. So whatever your basis for morality is
it subjective or objective?
I would say it's subjective. It depends on what your goal is. I don't think good and evil mean anything without an established goal, right? So if your goal is well-being, then you can say it's objective, because we can look at certain acts to see whether they promote well-being or whether they cause harm. But if your goal is worshiping a deity, that may or may not have to do with well-being, well, then you might be able to say, I would say that you can't tell what evil is anyway, because you have no demonstration of this deity that you're working. But certainly that's a subjectively chosen goal. Just because you think the goal is worshiping the deity doesn't mean that I do. If the deity says it's okay to own slaves and I'm basing morality on well-being, well, it's not okay to own slaves. So we've come to two different conclusions about what good and evil are based on what we think the goals are. I hope I made sense. I think I do, but I'm taking your silence as
I'm holding myself back. So like, I feel like I could say another hour's worth of just stuff here.
Tell you
So
what,
I don't want to do that.
Why don't we invite you back on, especially when we have Caleb, because he and I don't always see eye to eye, but it's good because, you know, we get to get on
Keeps
the
us sharp.
soapbox. And yeah, so come back on the show. We will schedule a discussion about what morality is, how it's different from ethics, and whether it's objective, subjective, how we evaluate those claims. But we definitely wanted to take a look at the transcendental arguments for the existence of God. I think it's kind of weak. I think all presuppositionalist apologetics are weak, which is why I don't really even bother with them, because I already intuitively know that the thing that they are asserting is false, right? So again, you're telling me that I'm a liar. I already know that you're wrong about me anyway. So if you're wrong about me, then what else are you wrong about? You might be wrong about everything else, and you're not willing to make a case to defend anything else. So there's no point in it. Other people, I think, like playing with the presuppositionalist apologists because it's entertaining. There's an entertainment value to it. It's kind of a show, drama. But they're not arguments that are going to convince anyone who isn't already a believer.
You guys watch Mr. Deity at all?
Mr. Who?
Deity?
No.
He's got a long running show, but he did a recent one on Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson was, making the same sad argument that, you're really a Christian. You're just denying you're a Christian because all your morality proves that you're a Christian. And Mr. D was saying Jordan Peterson is an atheist because he holds the same moral views that I have, and I'm an atheist. Therefore, that proves that he's an atheist.
And has Jordan Peterson responded to that?
This is a relatively new.
I doubt it.
I think it was uploaded yesterday.
Would he respond to it?
No,
I
so.
doubt it. Because Deity is kind of a joke show, comical, and Jordan Peterson's very serious.
Yeah,
but I've used the same argument with people who say here are the reasons why everyone's a Christian. Morality and beauty and just the fact that we exist is proof that God exists and God is Christian. Therefore, you're a Christian. You're just denying it. And I just turn it around and say, well, this is what the universe caused by the Big Bang. We don't know. We don't need to know. My morality is based on empathy, which is an evolutionary trait. And I'll give my list and say, you're an atheist. You're just denying an atheist because you're so trained to believe that there's a God. You just haven't
turned the tables.
They almost seem
you can't give up Santa Claus. You are an adult who can't give up God.
They almost seem like arguments that are really meant to convince themselves, to keep themselves trapped in the belief.
William Lane Craig and Ray Comfort and all these guys in business, because people are desperate to keep their faith because they think if I stop believing in God, I'm going to go to hell. Because I know atheists who are afraid of hell.
I would say that argument is true for the people that Ray Comfort and William Lane Craig and Cy Timberg and Kate and all these people that they're trying to convince. That's probably true. I think these guys are just flim-flam artists. They're con men who are making money off of not stupid, but they're con men making money off of gullible people who are already in a belief system. I don't think they really believe half of the shit they say.
Yeah. One would hope. But I know plenty of Christians who are, deeply devout, and they just, they know, they'll saying, I know it in my heart. My sister's one of these people. It's like they're just so convinced, and they don't necessarily want to proselytize. They don't want to convince anyone else. They just want you to know what they know, because what they know is true. Just any of it.
Ben, what do you have coming up lately? We have reached the hour mark, and I want to know if you guys we've had you on twice in 2 weeks, so are we going to get you back again to talk about what the ontological argument or a different kind of argument? What do you got coming up?
So I definitely could do a discussion on objective morality. We do have a podcast episode called Irreducibly Normative Truths. And so where I lay out my view of moral objectivism, or what's often called moral realism. And next week, I'm drawing a blank on the day, so I don't want to say the wrong day. But I will be on Zachary Sechler's show. He's a Christian theist and really into philosophy of religion. And so I will be discussing meaning and purpose in an atheist model of the universe. And so what can it mean for life to have meaning? And what can we, how can we look at the world as having some sort of purpose, even if we've rejected something like perfect being theism?
Yeah, that seems easy to me, but we look forward to that. How about you, Tom?
I'm looking for. I've been on a couple times, and the last conversation I had was morality, objective versus subjective, and I'm trying to. I forget the guy's name. It was T-Rump or
T-Jump?
Yeah.
Yeah, Tom Jump. I know him.
So, how do you feel, Ben? Morality. He was using the example of a rock falls off a cliff and lands on your head. That's objectively evil because it does harm. Would you agree with that statement?
And make it a short answer, because that's going to go beyond the scope of the.
Yeah, I would say that it was a bad thing that happened. Yeah. That the rock falling and hitting you was a bad thing because you were harmed. Yeah. And so that harms are evils. And so, but like the language that we use to say like something is evil, we often think that there's some sort of intention, but obviously rocks don't have intentions. So this is why I would want to opt for using a more neutral word that didn't presuppose that intention, like bad.
Yeah.
There you go. I have a lot to say about that, and I will offer you my opinion, Tom, offline. For good measure, Phil, go ahead and highlight the last question, I guess, or remark from Javier to kind of wrap it up. I don't remember exactly who said it. The purpose of presuppositionalism is to shut up atheists. This is not an excuse. This is not an exercise of demonstration at all. And I think that perfectly sums up the theme of the show. But if you guys like this show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. And we have the link right there. I'd like to thank everyone in the chat. I would like to thank both of my guests today. And we certainly look forward to having you come back. Secular Soapbox is on Wednesdays, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. And a shout out to some of our patrons, Sunny, Phil, who's kind of doing the good work for us backstage right now, Jena, and Linear, who's in the chat. Again, you can find links to all of our content down in the description below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome secular content. For Sunny Shell, producer Wes, producer Phil, Kat the Humanist, Trent, Jena, and Josh the Archon, I am Bryce Aroni for Team Promethean. We will see you in the future.